Australia's Labour Prime Minister, John Curtin.
I'm happy to be back in Australia. I've seen many things and many places. And although every man can be forgiven for loving his own country best, I believe it is an impartial assessment of the facts to say that I have not seen any country or any people better than my own.
Welcome to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast, brought to you by myself, Nick Firth, and Redbridge's Kos Samaras. Each week, we bring you the freshest and most challenging conversations from the world of Australian and global politics, culture and ideas. G'day, Curtinistas. Welcome back to Curtin's Cast. Nick Firth, head honcho of the John Curtin Research Centre, the mighty JCRC. I'm back with my co-host, Kung Fu Kos Samaras. G'day, Kosy.
G'day.
Mate, we've got the real head honcho of the John Curtin Research Centre today with us, Sam Almaliki. Sam's got a great story. He has lived the Australian story from the inside out. He was born in Basra, Iraq, the Levant, the cradle of civilization. Wouldn't say grew up, but spent part of his childhood in the Villawood Detention Centre after arriving in Australia. He grew up in public housing in New South Wales, in Nari, where I believe he was a radio superstar. He recently qualified as a lawyer, runs his own business. He's sat on many boards and is chairperson of the JCRC, and he's an entrepreneur, big interest in startups and AI and tech and housing, which we're going to talk about. It's a great story of resilience and reinvention and renewal, and I think his story captures both the hardship and the hope of the Australian experience. And it's a great pleasure to have Sam Almaliki with us on Curtin's Cast. Sam, welcome.
G'day, Nick, and g'day, Kos. Great to be on Curtin's Cast.
Okay, hopefully you don't sack us by the end of this. Sam, now you were born in Basra, Iraq. For listeners, tell us, where is Basra? What was it like growing up in Iraq? You came to Australia as a 9-year-old. I'm doing the sums. You grew up during the period, of course, Saddam Hussein was in power in Iraq, and also the Iran-Iraq war, which was an awful conflict, an awful tragedy, was running at the same time.
Yeah, so I was born in 1989, born in Basra in the southern city of Iraq, a port city, a port state, often been part of the trade route, particularly with countries like India. So in its own right, it's a very multicultural place. And while I'm deeply proud of my Iraqi heritage, the one place that I have particular affinity with is Basra. It's a city that's renowned for its artistic and intellectual bent, and famous for its hospitality in the Middle East, as being very hospitable people, and they're the kind of cultural roots that I hang on very closely and tightly. I was born before the first Gulf War between Iraq and Kuwait. So while I was fortunate not to witness the Iraq-Iran war, and very fortunately my family, my mum and dad, and my mum worked at the hospital at the time, and she was part of the emergency response, and my two brothers were born during the Iran-Iraq war, and they were very fortunate to survive. They saw homes around them, their neighbours impacted, et cetera, lost family members. But I was caught in the Iraq-Kuwait war, the first Gulf War, when my grandparents, my mum's parents, lived in Kuwait, and they were residents of Kuwait for 37 years. One weekend I was left with my grandparents who were taking care of me. Kuwait was only about, from Basra, give or take 2 hours drive. So it was a regular sort of reoccurrence for people to go backwards and forth. Well, the war broke out not long after, within the subsequent days. And so I ended up spending my first 12 months of my childhood with my grandparents. And that brought its own enduring trauma, even though I loved my grandmother dearly and spent, in fact, the subsequent years when they relocated to Basra living with my grandparents, my mum's parents. That in itself has had its own impact right up to now as an adult. So in many ways, the trauma of war lives on for people like me who were born in that conflict, and then the subsequent years of Saddam Hussein's regime right up to 1997. My dad, I've had an uncle that was killed by the Iraqi regime. My dad's 4 cousins from all the one family, from the same mum and dad, were taken away from their family in various circumstances over that period. But we were very lucky to flee in 1997, and I was 8 and turned 9 in Villawood.
Yes, that quite an experience for an 9-year-old child, and you were then known as Osama, not Sam. Sam's not a classical Arabic name. Tell us about Villawood and how did the family actually get to Australia?
Yeah, so and we'll come to the name Osama, which I also am very proud of and have strong affinity. It's my birthright name, and I can tell you how the name Sam came about. But our journey to Australia was first via Jordan, and my dad, he was a political science lecturer at Babel University, and Saddam Hussein had put in
it's basically Babylon,
it put in a rule in place that if you were a medical or PhD doctor, you could not leave Iraq. So my dad had to get a fake passport arranged where his occupation was that of a farmer to leave Iraq and get to Jordan. And that in itself was very challenging because he faced the prospect of being killed at the Iraqi border should they find out that he was carrying a fake Iraqi passport with the wrong occupation and, in essence, the wrong identity.
Sam, why did the regime have that rule in place? I know a lot about that part of the world and particularly that regime, but that's one little tidbit that I wasn't aware of. What was the reasoning behind it, you know?
I think fundamentally, and I stand to be corrected otherwise, but it was to stop the brain drain.
Brain drain, okay.
Iraq historically has had a very educated population. Yes. In fact, I've got a number of cousins, and my dad was offered this as the Iran-Iraq war broke out, was offered a scholarship to go and complete further studies in the UK. And as a result, many people then settled in places like the UK, where there are many top Iraqi academics, intellectuals, and surgeons, particularly in the medical field. So I think it was fundamentally to prevent the brain drain that was occurring. So that was my dad's experience, but initially it was my mum and 3 brothers who left Iraq to Jordan and then headed to Thailand, Bangkok, to be connected with people smugglers that my uncles had arranged. And 2 of them had already been in Australia already, and 1 other uncle in the US. But when we got to Bangkok with my mum, my dad was still in Iraq. She, in particular, got pretty homesick and concerned that my dad just wasn't going to take the risk and make it through the Iraqi-Jordanian border. And at great cost, she made the decision that we were returning back to Iraq, and this time around, my dad had to flee first. And we had to organise getting him to Jordan. So we went back, having sold everything, no place to live in anymore. My dad was staying with relatives. We've sold everything, we're ready to move and start this new life. And then the arrangements were made for my dad to get through from Iraq to Jordan. And that in itself was particularly tough for him and for us. And then we all made it to Jordan. We followed him. Then we got to Bangkok. And after a series of different attempts using different nationality passports, so we tried the British passport on the same day that Princess Diana was killed in that horrible car accident. We tried French, and then eventually my oldest brother and my dad were accompanied by somebody who was helping the people smugglers to get to Vietnam, and they took, I had historically thought it was French, but it was actually an Italian passports to get to Australia. Then we followed, that's my middle brother, my mum and I followed from Bangkok in Greek passports. And it's one of the reasons why I've had a long-standing affinity with Greek culture and history. And our destination was deliberately set to be to NZ, with a transit in Sydney. And my mum destroyed the passports, the fake Greek passports on the plane, flushed them down. She's a very brave woman. And here there were two young kids. As I said, I was 8 at the time, my brother 12, sitting next to each other, a very nerve-cracking trip. And when we got to Sydney Airport, we made sure that the plane had departed to its destination, which was Auckland. Waited a few more hours. We had federal police officers and custom officers approach us a number of times, making sure is everything okay, because it was rather unusual that we were still hovering and loitering around at Sydney Airport. Eventually, when they approached us, I think on the third or fourth time, as my mum would recount, we claimed asylum, and then we're taken to Villawood Detention Centre, where we spent 8 months. I turned 9 in Villawood. My dad had what we later learned, 2 heart attacks in Villawood, and was not treated for that. And we got right up to the final appeal with the Minister for Immigration at the time, Philip Ruddock. And it was only then that we were granted refugee status and were able to be released out of Villawood.
Let's go back just a touch, Bangkok. So when you were there, where did you stay?
Yeah, so it's all part of the, I wouldn't call it a 5-star treatment, but as part of the arrangement with people smugglers and the expense. And it cost at the time about $50,000 US for our family to come across. We were fortunate. We had help from family, and my family was, sort of middle class in Iraq. So there was an ability to financially be able to do that. We stayed in a hotel. The overwhelming experience for refugees trying to escape war, political persecution, is one of living in refugee camps. And my parents were just determined, and this is what people don't understand, there are so many people whose lives are in limbo for years in refugee camps, and I'm very grateful that my parents were not prepared to accept that for themselves and for their children, most importantly. And yes, that meant coming to Australia illegally through people smugglers and having that defiance to seek asylum in a place that was more peaceful.
Tell us about Villawood.
Yeah, I've had a lot of opportunities to sort of share my experience in Villawood, and I think the more you tell a story, you sort of sometimes can take a bit of a rose glasses view of things. And
I mean, it must have been traumatic seeing your dad ill. I believe you were separated from your father for a long period there.
Initially we were, because single men or men who did not have their partners there were put in Villawood Detention Centre number 1, and then we were put in Centre number 2. But eventually, and within the first month or so, we were reunited. Villawood was traumatic. As I said, I watched my dad being carried by ambulances on 2 occasions, having what we later found out to be 2 heart attacks, and he was immediately taken to Prince Alfred Hospital in Sydney and operated on when we got out of Villawood. I saw my dad and mum in constant angst, become depressed. My dad was smoking about 150, if not more, cigarettes a day, rolling them, the old machine, and just piling them on, and his pile didn't get very high because he kept smoking through them. And I also recall, sort of over the journey, I would say I've had this great connection with my parents in the sense that, not to say my brothers don't, but I've always been in tune with how they have felt. And so as a kid, I was really impacted by that. And we got called by the immigration officers over the megaphones at Villawood Detention number of times, and every time we would be rejected. So as a kid who might have been playing around or doing other things inside Villawood, I forever always thought they were calling out our name, and would run to my mum and say, I think they're calling our name. And of course they weren't, but that was the kind of paranoia and the kind of trauma that was beginning to build up. Eventually, of course, we get called up and we were granted asylum. One of the immigration officers, Greg, who was calling out people's name, I became good friends with. I began to call out people's names on the headphones, on the megaphones, and that was one of those rare occasions where I didn't end up being paranoid that they were calling out our name and we were getting rejected again.
Yes, because, of course, if you're speaking to your mum in Arabic, but you've lobbed in Villawood, you don't speak English, but as I understand it, you became kind of the detention centre interpreter. As a 9-year-old, you taught yourself rudimentary English and were interpreting for other refugees and asylum seekers.
Yeah, we were fortunate. I mean, detentions are horrible places, to say the least. Notwithstanding that, and we can talk about refugee policy, but I've had the long-standing view that refugees and migrants need to be processed, and you need to make sure that they have a genuine claim for asylum and refuge. So I've taken a long-standing view that that's a good policy objective. But what's a terrible policy objective is when you indefinitely put people in detention at the great cost of the Australian taxpayer and then spit them out as damaged goods. And that's no great way to set up people for being citizens that contribute, positive, productive citizens. In any case, in Villawood, we were lucky, despite the circumstances, that there were a number of people from the Catholic Church. It's, again, one of the reasons why I've had a natural bias towards people of Catholic faith. I mean, these experiences are life-shaping. We had other people who were just humanitarian volunteers, a lady by the name of Cara, who lived in Blue Mountain, sadly has passed away since. And then there was a solicitor, a young solicitor, 25-year-old Sonia. And after the first 3 months, because I was yapping away, as I still am, I learned how to speak English pretty quickly. I didn't read or write, but I could speak it. And so what began as carrying Sonia's briefcase, I began to also interpret for her when she was seeing Arabic-speaking detainees. And it was Sonia who really inspired from there on my passion for law, for social justice and advocacy. And that saw me pursue the law in later life. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but in more recent times, after a long-standing, almost 3-decade quest, about a month ago, I reconnected and reunited with Sonia. And
I was going to ask you that question.
Yeah.
And, are you speaking to her?
Yeah. So, it's I have reconnected with her, and that was only a month ago, having 12 months ago making an approach to a few people, including Legal Aid in New South Wales, to try and reconnect with her because I thought it was important to say thank you and just to see where she's at. And she's now based in Canberra doing a lot of work in the multicultural services space, still practicing as a lawyer.
Yes, of course.
And I have said that when I finally get my PLT done, she could move my admission because I've graduated, but I'm not yet admitted. So I look forward to her doing that.
That's an amazing story. That's really good. Yeah, it's very touching to actually reconnect with someone, because she'll be what, now in her 50s?
Yeah, early.
Yeah,
she's early 50s.
Yeah, about my age. Yeah.
You also I think you saw a bit of cricket in Villawood, Sam, which triggered a lifelong passion.
Yes, saw Tamil detainees playing cricket, and that opened my eye up to our national game. But then I was fortunate when I started school at Punchbowl Primary. My teacher, Mr. Hall, was a cricket tragic, as you often are, and he installed that passion further into me for cricket. And, I often say that my 3 great loves are my parents, Australia, and cricket. In that order, of course.
So what were your impressions of Australia? So how long do you actually spend in Villawood? 2 years?
8 months.
8 months.
But it's important, Nick, at that time, that was the exception. Iraq, refugees coming from places like Iraq and Afghanistan, often, as was my uncle's experience and many others, often only stayed for 3 months because they had genuine claims to seek asylum. It was only when the Howard government was further cemented from 98 onwards that people were indefinitely detained, and then, of course, offshore as well.
Yes, it's a real sliding doors moment. What the impressions, though, of Australian life, it must have seen, you've come from, again, it is literally, the cradle of civilization. What are your first impressions? You're growing up in Nauru, you're going to Punchbowl. You made this point at our curtain oration with Prime Minister Albo You were there doing a one-on-one interview, both proud housos, products of the public housing system. And that must be it must have been quite amazing for you to sit there in May 2025, sitting opposite the Prime Minister, having conversation as mutual public housing products.
From Basra, Bangkok, Villawood, and sitting in front of a Prime Minister a couple of decades later. Pretty impressive.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, sometimes you lose perspective on these things, and I think because I've integrated so well, because I'm surrounded by people who keep things grounded. For me, I lose sight of these things and the gravity of these things. But on a rare occasion, because I don't normally do this, and my family would really not have a full view of the things that I've done or been doing, you sort of don't. It's not a culture where you sort of brag, and it's certainly not my approach. But I did make a point of having my dad's very ill, so he couldn't make it. But my mum, and I made sure my youngest niece and nephew were there, and my sister-in-law. And only literally this weekend, I got a photo where my nephew, who's now obsessed with prime ministers, having seen his uncle on stage with our prime minister, he was at the library, and my sister-in-law sent a photo and said, "This is the book that Zane has chosen," and it was a book about Australia's prime ministers. And for me, that's really the sense of satisfaction and joy, the ability to pay for these kids, that there is a pathway for anybody and anyone to be anything, even if it just means interviewing the Prime Minister. That to me was the highlight of the night.
It was. It was certainly, and it was a highlight for me to meet you. I met your mum. You couldn't wipe the smile off her face. It was a grin as big as Luna Park there in Sydney. But growing up in Sydney, impressions.
Yes, and sorry, there's a few stories there.
Lots of threads being pulled together here, Sam.
Yeah, well, look, I think coming from Iraq, while my dad was under constant scrutiny, he had lost family members. It was a very difficult environment. My dad was a political science lecturer, and he was also working as a cabbie because of the hyperinflation situation and how difficult it was in Iraq. He was being monitored and under constant surveillance because of his job as a political science lecturer. Notwithstanding that, we lived a reasonably middle-class life. And then coming to Australia and starting a new life and seeing my mum, who was a biochemist, ending up working in a sweet shop, doing all sorts of jobs at a Lebanese sweet shop, Al Rabia in Punchbowl, to see her do that while also then retraining into a completely different career path and pursue becoming a teacher of English, because that was her interest in languages, and then seeing my dad go through terrible health circumstances and give work an attempt. He hasn't really been able to work for decades now, including working as a security officer. I mean, the early impressions were that this was pretty hard going, if I'm honest with you. We moved over 9 to a dozen times over that period, including spending about 4.5 years in public housing. But the one thing that I know my family and will say, and I certainly believed in this, whether it was in Villawood or outside of Villawood, we were fortunate that at every turn, putting aside the difficult immigration process and the unfair hand we were dealt, we saw Australian decency shine through every single time. Our friend Cara, who came and visited us at Villawood, accompanied us for the first few months and made regular visits to make sure we had settled in Australia. I mean, we walked out of Villawood not able to walk more than 100 metres because we hadn't walked. We had to stop. Our legs were sore because all of a sudden we were in this open space environment, having been in a closed space environment like Villawood. She supported and helped us navigate. We maintained our relationship with Sister Helen, and she was a terrific person. So we witnessed Australian decency. I mean, I rocked up to the Beverly Hills Cricket Club as a 12, 13-year-old, not because mum and dad took me there, but because I saw an ad in the local newspaper, the St. George Leader, and rocked up, and the families and the people who ran the cricket club, even though my parents weren't there, embraced me as like their child. So that was really, despite the hardship, the other big impression was the decency of Australians. And for me, that's never lost on me. I think Australians are very caring people inherently.
There are thousands of Australians out there who, have performed these critical roles over the last 20 years, right, Sam? I mean, whether it's Cara, whether it's, I've spoken to and worked with people over Australians Refugees Resource Centre here in Melbourne. They have, in their own way, touched the lives of so many people. Do you think that the political class fully comprehend? Because if we were to go through the entire Australian public out there, the entire profile, and work out just how many took that journey, you can go through the Vietnamese, the Lebanese during the Civil War. You go through thousands upon thousands of Australians right now who are living here today because they were assisted not only coming over here, but also when they got here. Do you think the political class fully appreciate the value of the work these people do?
I think some do, but not entirely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Here's a bigger point, Kos. I don't think all of those groups you've mentioned necessarily themselves appreciate the ongoing need for that kind of support. And that's the point I'm quite big on, that, I think Australia's a very generous place. And the obligation is on all of us to keep giving back. And so if you were a migrant in the 50s or 70s from any of the places you mentioned, the real question is, are you giving back? Not in just, a libertarian view is if you pay tax, you're giving back. Well, in a good old-fashioned Labor view of the world, that's not even the starting point. To give back is to have a big heart and to take care of your neighbours and look after and be part of your community. And so I think, for me, not as many people appreciate the genuine need there is out there in the community to support recently arrived people onto our shores. And most of those people, having been at the receiving end, don't want to have a lifelong handout. They just want help, a hand up in those difficult years. We didn't want to live in public housing forever, but it was an important part of our settlement journey, and then to being productive, positive, contributing members to Australian society. I think you'll find most refugees have that disposition. They don't want to be an impost on the system. They want to be part of a system that works for everybody, that contributes. So I think it's getting the broader community, not even the political class, not just the political class, to understand that need and that opportunity to contribute.
100%, Sam, and I can reflect on that. I was involved in Sydney mentoring recently arrived refugees, and one young man by the name of, g'day Raj, if you're listening, Tamil Indian from Tamil Nadu, brilliant kid. He was living in Punchbowl, so I used to trek out to Punchbowl, and we underestimate just the companionship, just being able to guide Raj through some of the intricacies of Australian culture. We bonded over, we had a shared love of cricket, which was fantastic. And it's just been so wonderful to see him go from strength to strength. He's married, he's got 2 kids now, he's living the suburban dream in Brisbane, and now runs his own small business.
Yeah.
It's just fantastic. And, that's a good experience, and I think overall your family, what you've brought to the table is magnificent. But something that Kos and I spoke about a few months ago on the pod was, you've just spoken about, we institutionalise people and then they're often traumatised, and so Australia's not making the best use of, in many cases, highly intelligent, driven people like your parents, political scientist, a biochemist, but they didn't work in those professions. And it's to my mind, and I think Kos is on the same, it's a terrible waste of human capital and talent.
Yeah, if you want to talk about productivity,
yes.
This is exactly where I think the Australian government And it isn't a problem that only the Commonwealth can fix. There's obviously state governments that need to get into this space as well. But enabling people who come to this country who clearly are, highly skilled, highly educated, to be able to work in those occupations and industries, because they've spent 4 or 5 years already training. The amount of people in my community that I have bumped into who are far more educated than I am, driving cabs, delivering Uber, because this country has failed to tap into their human capital. Yeah, I've lost count. Yeah, and that is, if you want to talk about one significant productivity loss, that is writ large.
Absolutely, and we've been talking about this issue for decades. I remember from my time on the New South Wales Multicultural Commission, we were talking about recognition of qualifications, giving people the opportunity to reskill quickly and getting them into critical jobs, particularly in our trades, in our building and construction industry, but also in the white-collar service industry, in the care economy, where we have many doctors, many nurses, and many other health practitioners who are simply driving cabs. And there's nothing wrong with that. But we're not, to your point, we're not tapping into their full potential and the opportunity to see the productive uplift that we desperately need as a country. I mean, any productivity shifts we've had in the last 2 decades have been largely a byproduct of the participation of more women in the workforce. Well, we have the opportunity to unlock that lever today with migrant communities, right? For a lower cost of reskilling. And when you talk about speed to mobilisation, if you've got people there, the skill set and the drive, you don't come to Australia, migrate to Australia, leave all your family behind to not want to make the best shot of coming to this great country and wanting to make a contribution and working a job that gives you a satisfaction and makes a positive contribution. So,
I've made this point before about Conservatives' misread of diverse Australians.
Yes.
And I'm going to make it again, and that is this complete misunderstanding that you look at the attributes your parents had. They're aspirational, they were highly educated, socially conservative, right? All these attributes, these Australians should be Coalition's Praetorian Guard. They should be front and centre, the people who will march out there and vote for the Liberal Party every time. And they haven't, because, of course, we can talk for hours why that hasn't occurred. But again, really good example of, you talked about Nick, the young chap you assisted.
Raj, yeah.
Raj, he's running a small business in Brisbane. Again, what more liberal can you get? Right? But
I know, he's voting for Jim Chalmers now, mate.
You got it. Correct. I already know.
Yeah. But there's that entrepreneurial flag. I mean, Sam, we're wasting that. And, as you're getting at, by definition, people who seek a new life as refugees, asylum seekers, are taking risks. And you've lived that life. And one of the really interesting things you did in Sydney was, as an offshoot of your love of cricket, did you set up Australia's first winter cricket competition?
Certainly Australia's first junior winter cricket competition, because there was an adults one. I started that with a bunch of school friends who said, why don't we play cricket on Sunday? I was playing rugby league in winter, and they said, why don't we play cricket on Sundays during winter? And from there started what later became the Sydney Junior Winter Cricket Competition. Had something like 100 teams across Sydney, across 3 divisions, about 37 grounds during winter. So we were competing with all the winter sports. And that really led my path into cricket administration.
And you went to work for Cricket Australia?
Yeah. So at 24, I got approached to join the Cricket Australia management team with a remit to grow the game and to get more girls and women, people from multicultural background, First Nations people and people with a disability to play Australia's favourite sport. And that was certainly been not just a career, but a lifetime highlight in that it gave me further opportunity to understand Australia, travelled all over Australia, went to communities out in Bourke, Broome, spent a lot of time in the Northern Territory, working with local cricket clubs in the country, in the city, and I loved every bit of it. And we were really making a positive impact through sport, and it just happened to be cricket. And when you give a kid an opportunity to hold a bat and a ball, whether it's a girl or a woman, and be part of a team, and I'm seeing that with my niece and nephew with their chosen sport, which is football, the world game, the difference that's making to their development, it's a very rewarding to see that. And certainly that was the experience over about 4 years at Cricket Australia. Worked with, as I said, great people, and that was the reason I moved to Melbourne in 2013.
Sam, 2 questions. Were you a batsman or bowler?
I was a leg spin bowler.
Right, there you go.
With the fast bowlers,
like a fast bowler,
with the fast.
No, you definitely know he's not tall enough for a fast bowler.
That's right. But I had a fast bowler's temperament, wanting to get them out every ball.
Hey, second question. What was the attraction to the Labor Party?
Really, really good question. And so I actually flirted with the Liberal Party as a 16 to 18-year-old and was briefly a member. And resigned on 2 or 3 occasions because I joined them because a very close friend of mine was involved, but also I thought I could be the Colin Powell of the Australian Liberal Party. But the reality is, and this is the honest truth, just in the way that Labor's DNA is collectivists and to fundamentally be pro-worker, the Liberal Party's DNA is never going to be pro-migrant. In my experience, I thought I could make this place more inclusive. I remember crossing paths with Philip Ruddock at one function and refusing to say hello because ultimately he was the reason we were locked up in Villawood. I remember coming across Bronwyn Bishop, and I was only 17, 18, in Pittwater at a by-election. And one of the first questions she asked me was, "Where are you from?" Yeah, and it was a question with malice, to which I said, "From St George," deliberately knowing where she was asking, because I lived in the suburb of Narwee.
Hey, Sam,
in the St George area.
We used to do the same when we were growing up. They used to ask us all the time where you're from. I knew what the question was about.
Correct.
And my answer was Broadmeadows, mate.
Yeah, correct. And I think it's important to...
Mate, I get that.
It's important to acknowledge people's and any organisations, any movements, DNA and default. And that DNA and default is very hard to erase. It becomes instinctive. And that's the issue that the Liberal Party has, despite its best attempts. It is instinctively a party that's attached to colonial Australia and this Anglo-Celtic sphere of the world.
See, they dispute that, though, Sam, and I think it's this is something that Kos and I spoke about last week. It's something that's really emerged from the 90s and 2000s because, the Liberal Party oversaw the great migration boom after the Second World War. Chifley set the train in motion, but, the Greeks and Italians and other Europeans, and it was the Liberal Party who actually did more, quite frankly, than the ALP to dismantle white Australia. Gough gets the credit.
Yeah.
So they've got that tradition there, and a lot of Vietnamese Australians we spoke to Dailei, arrested on libs, but over the past 2 decades, they've lost touch with that tradition.
So Sam, I mean, it's to the point that Nick's talking about, the Vietnamese community here in Australia, it was under Malcolm Fraser.
Yes.
The countless amount of I was talking to a Liberal, a young Liberal recently, and he was at Malcolm Fraser's funeral, and the amount of Vietnamese Australians that were outside the church.
Yes.
At his funeral, he had lost count how many were there. Now, they were an absolute roll gold constituency for the coalition to hold on to, and they've lost them.
Yeah.
In your case, you went and you obviously had a political, social reason you wanted to join them. Something about them was attractive. What was that?
Genuinely, and I would say the other factor was, particularly in my younger years, I have a social conservative bent. I don't in the same way today, but certainly this. And this is the thing. People think if you're pro-family, you follow the sort of mould of traditional families and you're anti-abortion and all of these things. No. That's the way in which Conservatives have framed pro-family, which is an absolute illusion and distraction from what it means to be pro-family. For me, pro-family is about the family unit and its role in helping individuals rise and be better contributors to the community. And I am unashamedly pro-family, and it really irks me when Labor moves away from that focus. Labor should be as pro-family as anybody, because it's about the care economy, it's about a safety net, it's about supporting families to raise individuals that have a roof over their head, access to a decent education and good health, the very things that allow families to thrive. So for me, there was the conservative, social conservative bent, but a genuine desire and view that I knew this was a political party that was anti-refugee and really wasn't pro-migrant. And while I take your points, both yours and Nick's, I think fundamentally the Liberal Party believes in assimilation, and that's where it gets unstuck. Because thank you for welcoming me, but you're not going to remove my cultural roots and my sense of pride in those roots. And both of you, more so than me, are great examples of that. You have great affinity and more than that, connection of your cultural roots, whether it be the Jewish culture and history, whether it be the Greek culture and history. And the problem for the Liberal Party, historically speaking, is they want you to be able to put that right in the background, not to the fore of who you are. Where Labor, and I think this is absolutely the right approach, although it's important we never lose sight of this. We embody the appropriate framing for multicultural policy. You can take great pride and live your cultural roots, but most importantly, under a shared Australian identity. And I think Prime Minister Albanese does that very well through his own personal journey and his emphasis on Australian patriotism, that you can celebrate your rich diversity, our rich diversity, but it's important to remember that it's under a shared identity of being Australian. Anyway, I failed in that attempt, and of course, Labor.
And we're very glad you failed.
Well, and so am I, because in many ways, Labor, when you think about the other aspects of my story, public housing, public education, all of that, and a real commitment to social justice, Labor is the natural home for someone like me. And just on the point of migrant communities, and I think because one way of looking at it is that migrant communities, because of their conservative bent on social policy matters, should be a natural constituency for the Liberal Party. Now, I know Nick also shares this view. I think that's true to an extent, but it's very important to recognise that as Australia's demographics have changed, we are increasingly made up of communities and cultures that have a collectivist framework. And for them, as it is for certainly my community, my family, it's not about me asserting my rights within the family unit or within the community. It's about me honouring my responsibility and my obligation to my family and to my community. And in that context, when Labor gets the bread and butter issues right, when Labor focuses on a safety net for all, as it did in the last election, when it spoke to people about the care economy, about making sure they've got access to childcare, to Medicare, and all of those other things, it speaks to people of backgrounds that represent collectivist cultures and societies, where they need the state to play that safety net role and recognising the focal role of the family in the community. And I think that's where Labor's hit the right note. If it deviates away from that and starts to focus on issues that assert individual rights without keeping them in the context of the broader community good, it loses that base. So we're at risk of losing that base if we don't strike the right policy program agenda.
Communitarian is the term.
Correct, yes.
That gets commonly used in trying to define the sort of like Labor philosophy which works for them.
Yes.
They have steered away from it.
Because I'm waving the communitarian flag here.
Correct. So that's and it's something that has been strongly associated with the right side of the Labor Party.
Yes.
And I would say right now it is probably the most important trait that keeps it still competitive in a complex landscape at the moment.
100%, Kos.
It's going to be in trouble.
100%. And Kos, when you add the other layer to all of this, is through the COVID experience, we all have come to recognise the important role that the state can play in ensuring that everybody's cared for and that everybody's looked after. And so that goes beyond migrant communities. You know, younger people realise that in the absence, for example, of mum and dad's bank account,
you aren't getting a home.
You aren't getting a home. So I do want the state to play a greater role. Well, that goes against the smaller government view and thinking of the world. And the proof point in all of this about Labor needing to make sure it always has a caring agenda that talks to the bread and butter issues is the fact that Labor historically, particularly in the last 50 years, not necessarily beyond the 70s, but certainly from the 70s onwards, it's had consecutive state Labor governments for long term, obviously kicked off by Don Dunstan and his pioneering government in South Australia. But then you had Greiner, Kane, and then others. And that's why we dominate that domain, because that's often where the service delivery occurs at the state level. And so it connects with that sense of, well, I know Labor will look after me. They'll have the right workers' compensation scheme, WorkSafe scheme. It will make sure that I can get access to hospitals and schools. And that's why we've done well. And federal Labor's caught on to that and starting to deliver in those areas as well.
But the big area, and one of your obsessions, is housing. And it can't be business as usual. Part of your sort of entrepreneurial flair, you know, you're involved in conveyancing, but housing is going to be, I don't want to over-dramatise this, but it could be the issue which will define, I think, this Labor government. Kos has previously said it's a wicked problem. Now, there isn't one silver bullet, but this federal government working in tandem with the states has to do something, because otherwise, you know, the demographics that you're talking about, and particularly younger demographics, are going to get very, very angsty.
Yeah. I think, Nick, it's not the issue that will define this government and the Albanese Labor government. It is the single issue that will define Australia and what kind of society we have.
Yeah.
If you don't get housing right, and the ability for people to access affordable housing, irrespective of where they live, irrespective of their occupation, you're going to see great social dislocation and a growing sense of inequality in Australia. I've heard this podcast and you talk with the likes of Andrew Hastie and others who would love to see the train arrive here in terms of populist right-wing politics. And the only reason it fundamentally hasn't taken off here is because the gap between the haves and the have-nots in Australia is not as wide as it is in those places. It is because we have a great safety net where populists, political movements who simply offer no solutions but simple messages don't have the conditions, the preconditions to exploit it in the same way. Where in England, people who are factory workers, people who are blue-collar workers, because of the fact they can't access housing and have great connectivity to important services, they're ripe for exploitation by people who offer simple messages and no solutions like Farage. And we've got to make sure Australia continues to be this cohesive society, this society where if you're a police officer, you're a tradesman, or you're a doctor, you can get a roof on your head and get access to critical services. We've got to keep that up, because if we don't, there'll be great dislocation and there'll be great disruption to this very idea of being an egalitarian society, which is why I'm passionate about housing and how we solve for it. And, you know, it's not for lack of trying, but the issue is really that I don't think we're trying in the right way to solve for this issue. In fact, sometimes we're exacerbating this issue through schemes and incentives that drive demand. I mean, any private operator, every time there's a grant or an incentive, they'll do what any merchant does. They build it into their price. And who pays? It's the same consumer, the same person you're trying to help, say a young person, to get into the market. I'm all for removing barriers to accessing housing. And it's not just any housing. If you're a young person You want to live where there are opportunities for social mobility. This is why it's important. And this is what's being missed here. You know,
you come from Sydney, and I think you'd struggle to find a home under $900,000 anywhere on the market that has 2 bedrooms, standard size, detached home. Anywhere. I think you could drive out all the way out to Campbelltown, and you probably get something about $950.
Yeah.
We were interviewing a younger version of yourself in one of our focus groups last week, and that individual made that point. He said, we said, well, do you blame population? Their response was not really. I mean, migrants are not going to be, I was born here, my parents migrated here, but migrants are not the ones going to be competing for me to buy that $950,000 home.
No, that's right.
That's right. It's like the problem is it's just too expensive.
That's right. Yeah. And that's why we've got to remove, and I think, you touched on my entrepreneurial flair. You can't expect the same system, the same structures to deliver a different outcome to what has transpired to date. And unfortunately, I'm a big supporter of the government's housing fund and a whole range of initiatives, the Housing Accord, and the ambition to build 1.2 million homes. But I don't genuinely believe we're going about it in a way that solves for this issue in a way that endures the test of time.
Yep.
And the only way you do that is by addressing the system issues that are causing this housing crisis. And so we need a greater focus on supply. We don't need just state governments and the Commonwealth coming together. We need private industry being part of the outcome here. We need unions. I mean, frankly, the cost of construction is just too high. And I know that's not that's not necessarily a popular view in the labour movement, but unless you reduce the cost of construction and unless you can get a faster from planning to build to program, you're not going to address the housing crisis. And we've got to start thinking about building communities at scale, vertically and in the outer suburbs. And I just don't think we're approaching it with that sense of urgency and with the right focus, which needs to be on supply.
One of the reasons we're going to be talking a lot about manufactured housing, which is also known as modular and prefab, which can reduce the costs. Because at the moment, Sam, you're right. We've got thousands of tradies out there constructing different little bits, whether it's in Nowry or Campbelltown in Victoria, and it's not going to build the houses that we need at scale. We're almost out of time, Sam. We could talk for hours, mate. I thought maybe final reflection, words for a young Sam. I love the fact that you chose the name Sam because that's my Hebrew name is Sam Shmuel. Final word for young Sam growing up in Western Sydney, Southwest Sydney, or perhaps growing up in northern Melbourne, reflecting on your experiences of the Great Australian Dream.
Well, I think growing up in Narwee in southern Sydney, despite it being in difficult sort of setting as public housing, there were a lot of people doing it tough. There were a lot of people suffering from various addictions and going through various trauma. It was a very joyous childhood. There was no family holiday apart from one, catching a train to the Gold Coast. Not once genuinely did I feel insufficient or not provided for, because I had a very loving family, a great community. And in fact, it was our next door neighbour's daughter, who were of Lebanese background from Tripoli, because I was kicking a rugby league ball, holding a cricket bat on my skateboard more often than not, or my bike. She coined the term Aussie Sam. And so when I went to enrol in year 7, we put my name as Sam, and that stuck ever since. So credit to Sarah, who was our next door neighbour. But it was a very joyous childhood, despite all of those challenges and aspects of my own personal story. I certainly, if I was to give myself advice, I guess, or reflections on that time, and not so much to me, but to kids of migrant parents, the kid that's out there that's really trying to make a sense of their place in Australia, and having come from seeing their own family make such big sacrifices, I would offer 2 reflections. One is know that you really can make of it whatever you want. And that's really the great Australian dream. That's a great Australian, if you like, proposition that no matter your postcode, no matter your circumstances, you can really make a go of it and be the best version of yourself. And I think that's important for the young people who've certainly had a similar experience to me. The second thing, and I think this is always easier to look back on, is to live your life and live your age. And I think if I look at my own experience, mainly by circumstance, but also by character and disposition, I probably was living beyond my years and didn't quite necessarily live my every stage of life in the way that I should have. And so I'd encourage those young people to live their life as I do to my cousins. I say, live like you're 18. Go and take your gap year if you can. It doesn't have to be flash, but live your age.
And practice your bowling, whether you're an off spinner or a leg spinner. Australia needs you. And Australia needs more people like Sam Almaliki. Sam, it's been a pleasure having you on Curtin's Cast. Thank you, Kung Fu Kos. Wonderful discussion. Sam, thank you. We're absolutely really proud not to have you leading the charge here at the JCRC. It's been terrific to have you on the pod today. To our listeners, thank you for listening. Check us out, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, Reverse the Flow, refer a mate. But for now, it's ciao and arrivederci.